Some of you know this is a long process, this book, and it's taken time. I think by taking so much time, I think it's become a better work. And I think most histories, most stories, as we learn more, we add new pieces to it. Whether this is a topic that you've studied before, that you're connected to, or just generally interested, I'm going to try to hit a number of different pieces here, and we can address more depth of things perhaps later on. But what you see in the first slide here is both the title, the image of the book, and a couple of maps. And if you're familiar with Crow Creek, you see the bottom map there. Crow Creek and Lower Brule are native communities, reservations in central South Dakota. They're right across the Missouri River from each other. And then the top map is a map of the Northern Plains, mainly North and South Dakota. And one of the things I found interesting in researching this book and this community was the connections between many people from many different communities. Not that surprising, perhaps, but as we look at individual places, we see how their ripple effects and influence is well beyond a single location. So on one level, this is a small community in the middle of a state in the middle of the country, but I think it reflects a lot of things. That said, this is a book about a particular place. It is not a history of all boarding schools forever. It's not trying to be a history of all experiences. It's a reflection on certain examples, certain stories to tell an overview of a location. The basic gist of the title is the whole idea of a community that was founded and established and evolved over time. History is really not like a final picture as much as history is a series of layers of ideas. What I tried to do is add a number of layers to this. Initially, this school was a school bent on assimilation and Catholicism. It was established in collaboration with the Catholic Church, particularly with the Benedictine order. By the end of the book, the transition moves toward taking charge, making change, which is of Native people running the school themselves. So the transition runs from a Catholic school to a tribal school, from a school promoting assimilation to a school that also promotes cultural resilience. And it's that evolution that we're going to be looking at today as we go through. One thing interesting to me, for those of you who have studied what are known as the Oceti-Sakowin or the Sioux Confederation, it's a connection of many different communities, Dakota, Lakota, Nakota people. And in a way, for generations prior to the schools in the 19th century, members of these communities would meet regularly, often at a Sundance or a trade fair. And many of the representative people from those communities actually end up at this school at the same time. History is a series of cycles, but it's interesting how people who are going to school at Crow Creek will actually end up connected to people from reservation communities in North Dakota as maybe 2 or 3 generations before their relatives might have been. So we see that kind of process is happening. Here's a couple images. Let's see if we can't get those to go in terms of how the school pictured evolves. And so I got 3 slides to begin with of how the school evolves from the 19th century up toward the present. And the individual images show the change over those times from the 1880s on across into the top right corner is the school that to a lot of acclaim comes in the 1950s, and then we evolved to an image of the school more recently in the bottom right. So structurally, the school has changed. That's without question. Let's see. The next image is a story of students and of the community, and how when we think about a school, it's not just the building, it's the people. And the people significantly is the school. One of the interesting early parts I noted in my research was when you talked about the school, for many of the Catholic leaders, they saw it as a Catholic school. Many of the native people saw it as an Indian school, and they saw themselves as running their school just as much as the Catholics saw themselves running the school. And in a way, it shows any institution ultimately has a lot of different perspectives. It's founded, it comes together in a certain formation, but it evolves in different directions because the constituent groups are so different. And here's an image from sort of a multi-generational, multi-ethnic band in 1892 on up to one of my favorite parts, which is the 1963 basketball state champions on the bottom right. In between, you've got a whole host of individual people and students who are connected to that. If we see the different parts of these, some of you might even recognize some individual people there. We could talk about that as we go from there. Let's see here. And here's an image of the school and the different individuals connected to it, from staff to students. We go from the 1890s on the top left to, I think, around World War II right in the center, and then we're into the 1960s on the bottom right. You can see a range of different groups and experiences. And if I can just point you to this, the image on the right middle, in a school, we see a school, of course, of Native students with American flag and very much a Catholic school as well. And in a way, it's a story of a school that included all those different parts. Run by the Catholic Church, supported by the Native community, with funding coming from the federal government sometimes. And those are some of the pieces that are connected to that. So next, how did I do this? Well, this is, like many works of history, a matter of gathering materials, sorting materials to try to gather as many perspectives as possible. And what you see here is a range of ways that I wrote this. Ultimately, we see, let's see here. Is there a way to, how are we doing on images here, Deidre? Are we good?
They're kind of, the bottom row is a little cut off.
It is, okay.
But we can see them. We don't see your
there
captions.
you go.
Is that better?
It says yes. Is that better? It looks the same to
Is that
me.
better for people?
Didn't change. I think if you hit the slideshow, you could solve that issue.
That was our problem to begin with.
Oh,
Slideshow didn't want to happen.
okay.
I think if you can move the toggle on the lower right of the slide frame down to the left a little bit, it will not let you move. The toggle, like to the right of where your cursor is right now.
The toggle on the bottom where the screen is?
Change your percentage to 100% instead of 110.
Mm-hmm.
It's that bar right there.
Yep, that bar.
Is that better?
Click on the bar.
Keep going. Keep going.
Click on the middle bar and then slide it to the
there.
right.
There.
Is that better?
Yes.
Yes. There you go.
Okay. Thank you. All right. So here you can see some of the locations of the sources. And what I began with was by looking at a school that's a Catholic school. I began by going to the archives where the Benedictines are from, initially in southern Indiana. From there, I found a whole host of materials, letters written by the priests. A large percentage of them are about financing, as you can imagine. People want money to run the school, and that's been a big part there. But interspersed within there, you can see a variety of individuals. Sometimes you see a class list. Sometimes you see a letter from a family member, different pieces like that. But essentially, it's the administrative arm. When I went to the National Archives, similarly, I could find lists of documents. I could find individual people who are referenced. I found a slideshow of the pictures that we have. I found a slideshow of what the individual stories were, what a meal plan would look like, things like that as we go through. And all of those individual parts are able to be found. You know, what is the schedule like? Things like that. When I went to the South Dakota Historical Society, I was able to find some maps. I was able to find some individual people who had reference to where are people living. And I could find those materials that are there as we go through. And as I looked at individual elements there, that gave me a sense of the geography. The Center for Western Studies was really important for providing a lot of the image that are in the book. And they had thousands. I was able to grab some, but it gave me some sense of individual actions that take place, locations that take place. The top right highlights the significance of oral history, and interviewing many individuals was clearly a big part of the story. Vernon Ashley was the tribal president at Crow Creek for a number of years. He has relatives that connected to the school. His son was one of the first people I met who was the principal of the school time. So deep kind of connections to the location. Mike Jandrew was the Lower Brule chair for a number of years. He's a graduate of the school as well. So I could get different generational experiences through those different parts. And Blue Cloud Abbey is where the Benedictines ended up. The Abbey ended up being a location for people, and some of the material I found, including a diary of a priest who'd been there for 30 years, was a big part of laying out what's actually happening on a day-to-day basis. That's a big part of what we saw and what I located through. In terms of how to tell this story, there's a lot of pieces. One of the key parts to look at has to do with how it's a story of Native people and Catholic leaders. And I think one of the important parts early on is to note the connections between those. In many cases, people like Two Bear and Drifting Goose reached out to Catholic leaders as they were reaching out to them. They found reason and support to find different things from them. Now, some will be critical and say, I can't believe that Native people are looking to Catholics at the time. It's a complicated and maybe an imperfect relationship, but there's clearly benefits groups have connected to it. And increasingly, as these Native leaders realize that the Protestants are particularly connected to the federal government, who's part of the group taking some of their land, we see them reaching out to different allies across the way. And I think that's an important part. As I said at the beginning, this story of Oceti-Sakowin people is broad. That image on the left highlights how tribal members and tribal communities and families really spread out over the Northern Plains. And what you see on the right side is the image from the first slide, and how many of those same groups of people reconnect at places like Crow Creek. I'm not trying to say Crow Creek's the only school that has multi-tribal connections, but it is one that comes across there. And I think that's an interesting kind of overlapping development that we see going through. In terms of founding the school, the story, I think, often is, and for many historians, we sort of write against stories we've been told, right? Let's get a new angle on this. I think the story that schools were imposed upon Native people has some merit. There's certainly a sense of the federal system coming in and trying to legally conquer places in the West. But there's also a story of agency and Native people pushing back and trying to find a way, trying to find a method to empower themselves to look forward for their community. Not so much looking backward as looking forward of what can we do to help ourselves. And what you see on the left, probably can't read easily, is just one of the first petitions. When several, over 100 people signed a petition saying we'd like a school, and we'd like to ally with the Catholics to create a school. And you see on the right a small timeline of the Drifting Goose delegation going to Washington, D.C. They're not just waiting to hope that the federal government will help them out. They're seeking out compensation. They're seeking out better arrangements. They're seeking out alliances. And through the 1880s, we see a range of individuals meeting with priests, connecting with them, and finally submitting this petition that leads to the creation of the school. The person on the left is Father Pius Bame, and he's one of the first Benedictines to arrive and run the school. He ends up being there for 30 years. He's got a deep, his is the diary I was able to use to learn about day-to-day actions. And he's the one that first meets Native leaders. And I think a real important theme to look at here is this juxtaposition of Bull Ghost and Standing Elk. Bull Ghost is a guy who clearly is reaching out toward the Catholics. He's reaching out and believes that the Roman Catholics can help his people. At the same time, Standing Elk is there too. And Standing Elk says, as you see in the quote, God made the earth, and all this land was made for the Indians. The white man is coming here to root out the ground. If you come for our land, we will kick you out. And he's very much assertive in that process. And I think we have a tendency when we tell stories to tell one or the other. I think it's important when we look at this school or any history, there are a lot of different people involved. And Standing Up ultimately sends his kids to the school there, but he is very suspicious. And I think we often think about the federal government being suspicious of Native people. I think we want to keep in mind that folks at Crow Creek are also keeping an eye on the priests. They're keeping an eye on the federal officials. There's really kind of efforts to balance off the relationships there. Well, why would you, if you're a Native family living at Crow Creek or Lower Brule, send your kid to a boarding school? Of course, in the 1880s, they don't have the stories of boarding schools that we might be carrying around. But if you think about what they're doing, they're looking for a way to prepare their kids for the future. And they realize reaching out, it can be a helpful process. They know that at a certain point by the 1890s, there's going to be a requirement to go to school. But by the time you move forward from there, we see that some students have already been sent off to Eastern schools. Some go to places like Carlisle and die there. And increasingly, as families realize, if we're going to have to send our kids to school, let's do it with people we have heard of, and let's do it close to home. And that's kind of the origins of families pushing for the school. This image in the bottom left highlights one of the earliest groups, but they had been sending kids to school before. In fact, some of the first students at Stephan had already spent a year or two at Carlisle when they came back. And as opposed to sort of maybe a menacing story of what the schools do, they really are humble. They're small, they're crowded. As you can see, there are several kids sleeping in crowded conditions. There's only one building and kids are running away regularly. In some ways, it's almost questionable what kind of school is happening in those early months and years. And over time, that starts to solidify, but it begins in sort of a humble fashion. It's also a story of a community whereby the students make the school, right? Again, it's a Native school as much as it's a Catholic school. Many more people are Indian students than there are staff that are there at the time. That said, much of the money is going to come from a Catherine Drexel, who ends up founding a missionary organization for African American and Native Americans. But she's not writing checks to the school unless she develops relationships. And when she goes out in the 1880s to the school and meets some of the kids and they write letters to her, you can see how they're feeding the process that goes further. And then we see in the second quote here, by the time we get to the fall of 1888, we've got a tradition of families come every fall. They come and help. They come to check in with the teachers. They come to help build buildings. We've got this regular connection that if you're going to school 5 states to the east, you're not doing that, right? But if you're in your community or near your community, you can participate. So the parents are connected, and in many cases, the schools allow the students allow the schools to even survive. When there's prairie fires and other things, the students are out there at night fighting fires. They are helping to keep the school around. So as much as there are stories out there of problems at schools, and there's also stories of students helping to keep the school around for the next generation. And one of the key things that's interesting to me, and those of you who are on here connected to Crow Creek know, is that this is multi-generational school where people have sent their kids there for 2, 3, 4 generations sometimes. It's not the same school in the 1910s as it is in the 1970s, as it is now, but we see families and relationships over time connected to the school. The complexities are both peculiar and interesting on some levels. One is that as much as people talk about boarding schools forcing kids to learn English, the irony of many of the first teachers couldn't speak English very well. They had German accents, and some of the priests would sort of marvel at how are they even teaching English if they don't know it that well. We also have a sense of how difficult it is, not just at boarding schools, but generally when disease hits. And it hits, and families come to take care of their kids, right? There's not just the drop off and be gone idea that we see in here too. And in many cases, we see examples of some of the staff working well and developing personal relationships with the students. Clearly, even in my research and in the book, I highlight there's examples of abuse. There's examples of people who've gotten hurt. There's examples of kids who died at the school. There's also stories of relationships that last and continue. I really don't think you should tell a story without both of those pieces in there. And from my research, I ran across all of those different pieces. And we can talk about that more later if people want. In terms of the structure, I mentioned these are kind of documents for the National Archives. What's the structure? What's the daily schedule for food? When are classes? To me, looking at something like this, I see it as more aspirational than it was followed every day the same way. But it gives you a sense of trying to create some sort of order out of what might be disorder often. And of course, this military discipline that's in there, as marching is part of the job, a part of the daily experiences. We see that as part of a day-to-day piece that's going on, and one of the pieces that's sort of the backdrop of the school. Big hit to me is not in those first couple of years, but by the time we get into the 1890s, like 10 years in, the school starts to really struggle. And like a lot of institutions, it requires lots of methods, lots of collaboration to survive. What does it face? Fire. There are many examples of fires at this school and many boarding schools over the course of studying the 19th and 20th century. Some are started by students. Some are then put out by students. I mean, it's a complicated mix. We can't really have singular people in here. The priests themselves come and go, except for Father Pius, who stays, but brothers all leave when we get into the 1890s. And then the federal government, as a result of the economic depression of 1893, starts pulling money out. So they're losing buildings, they're losing people, they're losing money. In some ways, they get down, and you can see the numbers here, how small the student body becomes. This is student body that after a while hits 200-300 when we get into the 1940s and 50s. Look at how small those numbers are. It's just about surviving in these times. And I think a key part that moves it forward is these relationships between the priests, Mother Catherine, the Bureau of Catholic Indian Missions, and most significantly, the community. By the time you get to the early 20th century, the federal government, the Teddy Roosevelt administration, supports the idea that Native people can contribute to their schools, and they can sign petitions yearly to send money to support their school. And you might argue, fitting with one of my earlier points, this school doesn't last if it's not for the Native communities themselves. The families who sign petitions, they go around and gather enough petitions to get enough money to keep the school around. And that's a really important part in terms of this community church relationship that we see through here. And each of the schools or other schools have done this as well, but this is a way to get through this collaboration between community and the church. You also see increasingly that students get involved with sending, with going out to gather funds. Father Ambrose Mattingly takes Drifting Goose's son, George Turner, and Reuben Manca on a trip in 1915 to gather money. They're actually part of the delivery system. He drives around in his Ford for thousands of miles. They gather money to keep the school going. So again, that's happening because of priests, but it's also happening because of students. And then the bottom piece, people who are connected to boarding schools would know perhaps is the regular solicitation campaigns. By the 1930s, fundraising is a big part, and students are regularly going to be involved with that. So they are working to help keep their school around. Big thing that hits for Father Pius in 1916 is another fire. And you get the feeling that for many of these priests, they might say, boy, this is never going to end. And what Father Pius notes is right after the fire, a Jim White and a Martin Chase lead a group of Catholic Indians to BAME and say, open that school again, whatever it takes. We want this going. According to Father Pius, they wanted me to open the school at once, as their children would not go to the government school, and they did not want them there. I never thought the Indians cared so much for their school. The question of rebuilding is no longer open. We simply have to rebuild. God wills it. And in a way, I think you see the community motivation is also motivating the priests to move forward and to solicit more and to help the school kind of grow and emerge through that. Through the 1930s, interesting ironies, of course, in history. If you think about the Depression and the decline of things, boarding schools really pick up. Significantly, at the 50-year mark, Father Justin Snyder, who replaces Father Pius when he dies, writes a play called The Trail of 50 Years. And in this play, he highlights the travails and the accomplishments, but you also see the enrollment start to grow. And as many people have said, some of you might know the book by Brenda Child called Boarding School Seasons. She highlights it as well. The whole idea that Native families turn to schools to basically support their kids during the depths of the Depression. Doesn't mean they're giving up. It means there's sort of this collaboration or making use of a school as a support network during that time period. And the numbers grow tremendously during that time. The school also starts to really pick up its fundraising. They create this regular publication called the Thanks Joy Wobida that gathers support. And increasingly, we start to see students connected to national programs, from CCC programs to participating in joining the military, which we'll see in our next slide as we move into the World War II time. By the early 1940s, the schools in isolated locations, perhaps like Crow Creek, are reaching out. Extracurricular activities is a big part of that. Stephan is known, along with St. Francis and some of the other schools, Holy Rosary, as having good basketball teams. They go to state tournaments. And in 1940, they go to the national tournament in Chicago. You start to see students with experiences outside of their community and connecting in with, competing with, participating in broader state and national developments. And that segues well into the huge impact of Native students and the participation in World War II. When World War II begins, we have this picture here I have on the bottom right, is a number of folks from Crow Creek and Lower Brule get in a car and drive to Sioux Falls and enlist in World War II. So the story of Native history is often about what was taken away, the losses that took place, but increasingly we see the shift even at the school of people participating and contributing to the American story. And everything from Elmer Comes Flying, who's part of the recruiting group, to Edmund St. John, who is part of the Dakota Code Talkers during World War II. We see Native people participating outside of the school, having been trained in their school and in their communities, and using the traditions they have culturally, as well as the developments and skills they picked up at school, to then contribute outside. Their influence is broader. To me, one of the pinnacle parts of the research was running across individual people. And as I did research, people like Ramon Rubidoux really stand out. At the end of World War II, actually during World War II, the federal government starts to dam the Missouri River, which is a whole long story. But in the process, by damming it, they're creating dams for hydroelectric power. They're also creating huge flooding of native communities, many of which are along the Missouri River. Ramon Rubidoux is kind of connected that in a way, but he links the 1940s in with the 1950s. He's a graduate of Stephan, goes on to World War II, comes back home with his mom. They try to go out to dinner at a place, at a bar, and they get kicked out for being Indian. And Rubidoux, as a graduate and a World War II veteran, is shocked by this and realizes he better hire a lawyer. He can't find a lawyer. And then you might figure maybe what's next. He decides, I'll go on to college. So he goes to college. He goes to law school and becomes the first Native lawyer in South Dakota. So we've got a story of Native students who've learned at their schools and they've developed enough. And in a way, he therefore might be, if we looked at it in a small level, the story of an assimilated Native person who ends up entering the legal profession. And that's partly there, but what's the biggest thing that I came across with him, I think, was he ends up, after many years as a state attorney, he ends up becoming one of the lawyers for the American Indian movement in the 1970s. So now you have a Native student who went to a Catholic school, got the assimilation tools, went off to World War II, became a lawyer, and is now fighting for tribal rights in the process. So we see this sort of evolution and multiple layers of what individuals do with these school degrees. A simple level would have them, they enter and merge into American society. And in a way, he represents that partly, but he also represents the story of people who enter the world with new skills to promote Native agendas and ideas. He's also part of the many people who push back against the dam projects that are going on during that time period. Many of the students who I connected with and interviewed would include people who graduated in the 1950s and 60s. Mike Jandrew and Clarence Sky are two of those guys, and they gave the experience of the 1950s as one of the largest graduating classes with many students, and they are part of the group that really created a culture that was there. And as Clarence Sky says, you learn the system and then you work the system. He says you learn the rules of an institution, then you learn how to work within it, how to manipulate it. And both he and Mike Jandrew end up in different prominent positions in the state. And I think some of that skill development they had during the school time then can be shared and used beyond. So I think that's another key piece that I uncovered when I went across. The later generation, we see big shifts. By the 1960s, the school that was once very much a Catholic school then shifts to become a school where students have a sense of their own Native identity. They're starting to produce they're still producing a newspaper called The Drumbeat, but increasingly highlights less of the sodalities and the Catholic organizations and more about Native identity. More articles like you see here, what makes people great? Stories of people resisting and promoting change that happen. They'll be critical of situations, and much like many students in the 1960s, they're starting to look at new directions of where they might want to go. Ultimately, the school is developing enough through the 1960s. The turn toward Native ideas and identity is growing. And at this same time, the priests who are a new generation also turn to the tribe and say, this is time for us to pass this over. This is the time for the leadership to shift from priestly leadership to tribal leadership. And as Father Stan, who actually, interestingly, develops a Center for American Indian Culture at a monastery at Blue Cloud Abbey in northeastern South Dakota, as he says, we want to reverse the roles. We don't think it's proper for us to tell parents how their children should be educated. we ultimately think that this school should be run by local people. And by 1971, the Crow Creek Tribal Council designates the school as the school of the reservation, as opposed to a Catholic school on the reservation. And that's part of the transition that goes on through there. So my work kind of ends around there. I do a little bit later on in terms of bringing it up to the present, but it's really about the story of this school that started with one agenda and moved to another by the time we get into the 1970s. And this image here is the ceremony of the transfer over to the Crow Creek tribe. This is the image of the school at the time. So what do we learn? We learn that education continues at Crow Creek. It's not that the schools at Crow Creek are now perfect. No schools are perfect, particularly in rural America where funding is an issue. That's a challenge. But what we see is we move from a school that was being directed by outside forces and other traditions to local members directing their own school. It's a story of kind of local reform. It's a story of cultural persistence. And it's a story of people who engage with themselves, engage with each other, develop rapport, develop alliances, and then help to enhance their own community. So that's kind of what I have for you today. And I'm glad to entertain other questions. But just as my last point, I'd say, I mean, to me, what's significant is tracing on the local level, who are people doing things? I think we have a lot of macro histories of big leaders and decision-making. I think what we see instead is here, local folks making decisions, working with families, working across lines, and in a way, kind of humbly moving forward. And if our society needs anything today, that might be one of those things. So hopefully there's some stories that you might be interested in to looking at in terms of community development there. So that's what I have.
Rob, that was so wonderful. We even have a comment. This presentation is excellent with 5 exclamation
Did I stop
points.
sharing?
Yes, you may stop sharing. So audience, put your questions in the chat. And in the meantime, perhaps Rob would tell us how he got inspired to do this project. What led you to this fascinating mass of material?
Yeah, I guess I didn't do my quick bio, but I was a teacher at on the Pine Ridge Reservation for a number of years, which is on the western side of South Dakota. And having taught there for a while, I realized how little I knew while I was there. And from looking at it, I was trying to understand, how do these schools operate? And I realized when I was getting there as a non-Catholic teaching in a Catholic school, I saw what the priests and leaders were doing, but I'd hear stories from my students that I had to come in late today because I went out hunting before school, or I'm on the powwow circuit, or I go to a sweat lodge ceremony and see students practicing traditions. And I realize this assault of assimilation is one story, but there are stories of engagement. How did that happen? How did that continue on? And to me, it was about, let's uncover how this school developed. And what I originally had done with my master's thesis was a history of Red Cloud School of Pine Ridge. And for my dissertation, I decided I'd look at a different school in a similar region, but see how that development came about. So it's basically coming from realizing how little I knew and how could I unpack some of those pieces more? How could I try to understand that a little bit more?
Very impressive, and so many wonderful stories that you've woven together. And so we have a question about vocational programs. Were there many in the Native schools, these vocational programs?
For sure. I mean, that was a big part of it. Depending on when and who you ask, there are certainly times and regularly Native schools were known for, especially once kids get old enough, working half the day and going to school half the day. And for many people, I mean, there's criticisms of that. There were some parents who found out about that and said, I got plenty of work at home. I want him to learn school. If you want him to work, I'll bring him home. Some didn't like that. Some did like that. Some of the students really liked that because even at boarding schools, in some of them, if they worked certain chores, they got certain benefits. Some of them got paid if they were doing the milking early in the morning. They knew if they were connected to butchering, they'd get some good food. They knew if they were working in the kitchen, they could get access to things. And, what do teenagers want more than food, right? I mean, there's a certain amount of benefits they had from there, but also on the more serious note, I mean, they're helping the school survive by providing the material. And many people end up using skills that they use later on in life, or at least some do.
That's so fascinating. So I'm waiting as we're waiting for more questions to come in. I have so many in my head. At the beginning of the presentation, you said something about the different Lakota leaders who went looking for a school, or looking for Catholic missionaries to bring in a school, that they wanted that as a foil in a sense, or maybe a way of protecting themselves from the Protestant mission schools that were linked to the U.S. government. Could you say more about
Well, I
how
mean,
that worked out?
I'm glad you brought that up, because I mean, one of the key themes to look at is the historical context. In the 1880s, there's a lot of land loss happening in South Dakota. And there's land runs where people are just going to the land office and taking over land. In 1883, Crow Creek actually had a lot of non-Indians come in and take over land. Some were pushed out, some weren't. So it's fairly clear, Crow Creek and Lower Brule, not only might we lose land, we're seeing it happen. And how do we be at the negotiating table with better skills? How do we work this better? And that's when this alliance with, and sometimes some of the leaders like Father Martin Marty and others would actually be at some of these sessions. That's when they start to realize, well, if we had a connection to these folks, and if we had more training, we need the skill set to hold on to our people, right? We're looking forward. How are we going to survive if we keep having our land taken over? We're going to do it by training ourselves. And they had the foresight to reach out to people who were reaching back to them. And it wasn't really necessarily so much they found somebody, they had relations before. And there would be sometimes several generations of people who had met Father DeSmet or had met Father Marty. And as a result of that, they reached out further that way. And so it's an interesting time period. I mean, in the 1880s, we're still before the Wounded Knee Massacre. We're at a time period where there's a lot of tension and uncertainty. And you can see, I think, that people in that circumstance are going to try to reach out and find, what are we going to do to move forward? We're not just going to wait and hope things get better, right? So it's a really active kind of piece to its story.
So we have a couple more questions that are coming in that kind of build off of that. So do you have insights on the activities of the Episcopal Church on reservations? And are there similar relationships?
Well, actually, I mean, the way the system worked was that initially the federal government designated different denominations per reservation, and the Episcopal Church was the first one at Crow Creek. After a while, they opened it up, and the Catholics came in. But the Episcopal Church kind of had the agency, and they had their church there, which was right near Fort Thompson, which is the main town of the reservation and just south. So when the Catholics are going to set up their school, they set it up more to the north where families are more interested. And you might argue geographically, people want to send their kids to a closer place because that's a time period where transportation, even across a single reservation, is hard. But yeah, the Episcopals would have been there. They did have a school. But like many of the Protestants, after a while, when money was tight, they just ended up teaching at the federal schools, got to teach Protestantism in a way, and not have to pay for it. The federal government would, because the government is very, Protestant focused at that point. Catholics are keeping their separate places more likely.
And related to that is a question about, in your research, what surprised you most about the transition from Catholic school to tribal school? And were things in the records, maybe in the correspondence, conversations, oral histories you did, interviews among tribal leaders, parents, Father Stan, staff, that stands out in particular as that change was made from Catholic school to tribal school?
Well, I mean, I think you get hints as you go along of clearly I mean, I think one of the ways to look at it is how do we get to the fact that the transfer takes place was kind of where I began with, and how did it get there? And I think some of the earlier indications of just parents regularly connecting to the school, helping to build it, showing up, keeping an eye on, and you hear some oral histories, you find out, wow, they knew exactly what was happening because their aunt worked at the school. And so you see those kind of connections that are there. You also hear the priests by the World War II time have a different sentiment. And they start writing about we really need to work with the parents. No longer, even by the 1950s, no longer is we're doing it this way. They have half of that, but they're starting to reach out to say we need to work with the parents. Now, they still have very much a paternalistic attitude. I don't want to make them into, 21st century liberals necessarily, but they believe that they should work with parents. And at that point, we see a reaching out in both ways. And then just hearing different individual students and how they saw themselves. And you could see, and other people have written books on other boarding schools about the influence of the students internally. And so they're involved with the school in terms of developing the local relations. They figure out where's the power structure. If we want to get a trip to Pier, who do we talk to? So the students themselves have some influence over how things develop as well. So it's really a multi-pronged approach, how it evolves. And then I think clearly I could probably mark it off, like by 1967, the student newspaper, it's clear these kids are dressing differently. They don't like how they're being treated. And it fits almost in sync with a lot of the more stories you hear about rebellious teenagers through middle America generally, of pushing back against what the system is. We want to be more influential on that. And so I think it's really a multi-pronged transition that's happening. But a big part, I guess, to answer your question, is happening in the 1960s. Which doesn't mean kids are still not going to church. They still are. Pretty soon, by the late 60s, they don't have to go anymore. But we see that kind of transition going on through that time period. Post-World War II is the big change that goes on.
To go back to the very beginning of all of this, we have a question about wanting to know more about Drifting Goose's role in founding the school.
Well, Drifting Goose is a really important person. And he's one of the last Native leaders to come to the school. There's a whole deep history of Drifting Goose himself. Drifting Goose, one of a few people who had his own reservation for about 1 year. The federal government recognized it and then takes it away a little bit east of Crow Creek along the James River near, I think, Redfield, South Dakota, somewhere around there. But when he comes in, he really recognizes the need to work with others. And especially as he sees his land supported by the feds and then taken away, he goes to Washington, D.C. And I think you see sort of the Native diplomat, and there are many, he's not the only one, the diplomatic sense of what am I going to do? And you can see, I mean, on the first slide, it had an appeal that was partly written by him, but of him going to Washington and him saying, I want to support my people, I want to move forward, and these are the things I need. So sort of really reaching out to that. And in a way, I think that gets it started. And over time, he, of course, initially, right in the early years, sends his kids to school. He sends one kid actually to Carlisle. She stays there for a few years and then comes back. But we see clearly a recognition of, I've been to Washington. I know what power's there. We're going to need to work in this system to continue on as ourselves.
Last question is, do you have a sense that this story at Crow Creek is singular, or is it similar to, especially the question we're asked here is about Marty Mission. Is it a fairly similar story, or do you feel like things are different at Crow Creek?
Well, good question. I mean, there are clearly several people who go back and forth between the schools. And I think it was Clarence Sky, but I might be wrong, who said, yeah, I was going to Marty's school, but the word on the street was the food's better at Stephan, so they transferred. There's different stories about which school was better or not, but many of them, not surprisingly, maybe we all have this about our alma mater, saying that like our school is better than the others, right? But a lot of people move back and forth between them. I suspect many of these same parallel stories are taking place. I know, having done research on the Jesuit school at Red Cloud, I mean, many of these kind of developments are happening in that fashion. But what's a key difference is not so, I mean, so there's a similarity. I think one of the key differences is we hear a lot of stories, and I think the literature is more filled with the federal off-reservation schools that are, you know, in Pennsylvania, and they are by nature going to be different. They cannot have parents regularly visiting. It's too far away. The connection to what's happening at the school and the families are different. So each school has its own difference, but I think the categories of those that are more local versus more distant is a big difference. And seeing how differently they develop. And there are many schools that were once boarding schools that have transitioned to tribal schools now. Marty is one of them. You know, Crow Creek is another one. You know, Red Cloud, St. Francis, many have done that. And I think they've gone through similar kind of iterations and changes. So there's some similarity across the board, but they all have their different people, the different pieces that happened, and the local politics are going to be different too. Who's the political leaders in the 1970s? What do they want? Do they want to actually run the school, or do they want to have a say in the church still running the school? And there's varied permutations that way too.
I said that was the last question, but I'm actually going to throw one more in there.
You got the prerogative. Go ahead.
I think it's interesting because you showed us the structure early on of what their day is like. And so we have a question about the marching. The marching is part of the curriculum. What that was supposed to be about, and did you see the curriculum shifting and changing? So as a history teacher, did anything surprise you about how history was taught, if you were able to see that?
Well, I mean, as a former teacher too, I mean, one of the things I was very interested in was, what are they teaching? And there aren't that many boarding school books that talk about what's actually happening in the class beyond what's happening on a macro level. But I was able to find the names of books that they used, and as a history teacher myself, look and see what's in these books. We know that at that point, very few of the teachers are trained to teach, let's say, history or geography. They are just given a book and they tell the information, right? Very much that method. So I think in a way you get a feel for what are they teaching by what's in the book. Nowadays, hopefully, better teachers don't just teach their book, they teach beyond their book. But in that point, they probably were. And I think what's maybe not surprising, but probably far more consistent with what we see in all schools, is as you move into the 1950s and 60s, there's this belief of we should have people do more creative projects. We should have new ways of looking at things, but they still have the sort of the same Eurocentric model of how history runs. And so you can teach things with new flares, but if you're basing it off of the perspective of Native people are backward and the American system is the best, you miss all those other parts to it. So as much as I saw some changes happening, the curriculum and the books weren't changing really any faster than anywhere else until you get to the 1960s. And by the time you hit the 1960s, you see, and this is either a nod to the priests and or the pushing of the community, you have community members coming in and teaching Dakota. You have community members telling the local history that's real. And you have stories of what Native people at Crow Creek were doing being told at the school, not just what happened in some whitewashed history from Washington, D.C. So you see that starting to kick in by the time you hit like the late 1960s. But it did take quite a while. So the mindsets change, but I'd say the same thing in our world today. People are still teaching very 1940s version of history in schoolrooms. They're doing it with a little flash. They're having their kids make PowerPoint presentations, but the new ideas, I think, need to rise up. And I'm hoping highlighting what community members do would be important. And I think very infrequently did the school actually look to the community for ideas. They just told what they thought they knew, which was often quite superficial.